Continuing on with the characteristics that define life. So our next characteristic is organisms respond to stimuli. We are described as being irritable beings. So say for instance, so if we respond to this external stimuli, but we also respond to internal stimuli. But for example, most organisms, say for instance, if you hear a loud noise or a bang, you're either going to run or a duck or whatever, trying to move away from that particular stimuli. If you're cold, for example, you're going to move towards the heat. Especially if you see a fire in a can or whatever, if you're outside, or you're going to turn up the heat in your house if you are cold. So movement constitutes a large part of its behavior, an organism's behavior. So behavior is usually directed toward avoiding injury or acquiring food or mating, for example. So based on internal responses to stimuli, one of the words that we want to learn now is homeostasis. Okay, so homeostasis means that you are trying to maintain the internal environment within a certain boundary. Okay, maintenance of the internal environment within certain boundaries. So we know that, again, we mentioned before in another video, for example, if your sugar levels are out of whack, okay, your body is either going to say, hey, for example, if you haven't eaten, and that means that the glucose level in your bloodstream is probably pretty low, then your body could signal the pancreas to release glucagon. Glucagon will stimulate the pancreas, the liver, to break down glycogen, which is how we store excess glucose. And therefore, when you break down glycogen, you're going to be releasing these glucose molecules back to the bloodstream, which is going to put the blood stream glucose levels back to a normal level. Same thing with insulin, for example. If you're hyperglycemic, for example, then what's going to happen is the pancreas will release insulin in order to start the uptake of cells to take that excess glucose out of the bloodstream, okay, and return those levels to between 80 and 100, okay. So that's a good blood sugar level, okay. So another example would be human body temperature. It's going to fluctuate throughout the day, okay. Say for instance, let's say if you got too hot, we know that the sweat glands will release sweat onto the surface of the skin, and when that moisture is evaporated away, that returns body temperature back, for example, to normal. But homeostasis, again, is the maintenance of internal conditions within certain boundaries. All right, so the next one, characteristic that defines life, is organisms have the capacity to adapt. During nearly 4 billion years of life that has been on Earth, the environment has constantly changed. And so, therefore, some individuals of a species may be better fit in a new environment. So, for example, let's look at birds, for example. We know that penguins are birds, but penguins have had to do what? They have an extra downy layer of feathers. They have blubber. We know that they live in the Antarctic region, and that's very, very cold. We know that their wings also have been adapted for swimming. So it's the adaptations, therefore, are features that make individual organisms better suited for a particular environment. individuals. So therefore we know that individuals better adapted to the environment produce more offspring. So natural selection, therefore, is the differential reproductive success of those adapted individuals. And then evolution is the change in frequency of those traits in the populations and species. All right, so let's go on with the thought of we have these organisms now. We need to be able to classify these organisms. So living organisms are assigned to groups based on their similarities. Okay, so taxonomy is the discipline of identifying, naming, and classifying or grouping organisms. Taxonomy is the discipline of identifying, naming, and grouping a particular organism. We know that Carolus Linnaeus, let me see if I can find a pen. Carolus, okay, that's not a good pen. Here we go. That's an E. That's hard to write with this pen. Carolus Linnaeus, we know that he was responsible for this original naming and classifying system called taxonomy. Okay, systematics, we know, is the study of the evolutionary relationship among organisms, and it helps better understand the variety of life on Earth. So taxonomy, again, is the idea that we identify, name, and classify. Systematics is the study of those relationships among the organisms. So we know that each organism is classified into a domain, domain being the most inclusive of the organisms, and then we know that species being the most exclusive. Okay, so this one is going to be more specific. This one is going to be this category is going to be broad, and this one is going to be specific. So we got domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And we'll note later that they've added another category, which are going to be the super. Okay, so we know that there are three main domains. Again, the domain being the largest classification category, so it's the most inclusive of the categories. There are three main domains, and that's domain archaea or archaea, depending on who you're talking to, domain bacteria, and then the final domain is eukarya. So archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. The domains archaea and bacteria, we know that these include the unicellular prokaryotic cells. So it says these are cells that lack a true nucleus. In other words, the word prokaryotic is letting us know that the nuclear material, meaning the DNA, is not housed within a membrane. So we want to say that or know that the word prokaryotic means that it lacks a nuclear membrane. And I think I said cell membrane a minute ago, but that is not what I want to say. I want to say it lacks and I'm going to take this out, and I want to say it lacks a nuclear, I'm trying to write, man, this is really hard, lacks a nuclear membrane. Okay, so we want to know that the DNA material is free floating in the cytoplasm. So we know that bacteria and this special category of organisms in archaea, it says that they lack a nuclear membrane. So then the domain eukarya includes eukaryotic cells, and it says that they are cells with a true nucleus. Why is it a true nucleus? It says because the DNA material is found within a nuclear membrane. Okay, so it is bound within a nuclear membrane. All right, so the unicellular prokaryotes, again, it says they lack a nuclear membrane. It says, well, where do we find these guys? It says they're found almost anywhere. We know that they're in the water that we drink. We know that they're in the soil. We know that they're in the atmosphere. We'll find them on our skin, in the mouth, in the large intestines, okay? So these guys are found almost everywhere. The unicellular prokaryotes in archaea, it says usually these guys, they live in these extreme environments, and what I mean by extreme, so these guys are called the extremophiles. Okay, they exist usually in conditions that are too extreme for other organisms to exist in. So generally too little oxygen, or they may be too salty, or it may be too hot or too acidic for most other organisms to survive. So again, we call them collectively the extremophiles, but we could have halophiles, for example. Those are the guys that live in these areas that are too salty. Too hot would be the thermophiles. We even have some, for example, that live in conditions that are way too cold. We call those the psychrophiles, and that's PSYCHROPHILES, the psychrophiles. Ooh, it took me a minute to get my brain to working. All right. Domain eukarya, continuing in the kingdoms. So the eukaryotes, okay, remember again, these are the ones that have a true nucleus because their nuclear material is bound within a nuclear membrane. All right, so we have kingdom protista. This is the one that we'll find out is split now into several supergroups. We have kingdom fungi, kingdom plantae, and kingdom animalia. Okay, so protista being the smallest of these guys, and animalia being the largest of these guys. All right, so if we looked at the kingdoms, the first one, protista. Protista normally includes the algae, the protozoans, slime molds, water molds, and again, these are complex single cells. They have some that are multicellular, but within this category, we know that many will be unicellular. Okay, well, how do they get their food? They absorb their food, as well as photosynthesize, and some of them even ingest their food. All right, let's move on to the next the next kingdom, which is fungi. This includes your molds and mushrooms, and also yeast and ringworms. These are mostly multicellular, so you can have a few unicellular guys in the kingdom fungi, but most of them are multicellular. And it says, how do they get their food? They're going to absorb their food from the ground or the tree or whatever they happen to be on. And then the next one is the kingdom plantae. examples of plantae, algae, mosses, ferns, conifers, flowering plants. Okay, your trees, all these guys fit in here. All right, so multicellular, usually with specialized tissues. For example, we know specialized tissues in any green leafy plants. They are specialized for what? Photosynthesis. They can absorb sunlight and take in water from their root systems and make sugar. And another big thing that they make is what? Oxygen gas. Without it, we would not be able to breathe. Okay, so it says they can make their own food. It says that they can photosynthesize. They make their own food. All right, then finally the kingdom Animalia. This includes sponges, worms, insects, fishes, frogs, turtles, birds, mammals. We know that these guys are multicellular with specialized tissues that carry on particular functions as well. And it says, well, how do they get their food? They ingest their food. For example, the big tiger or lion can hunt down and eat some other animal. All right, so let's go into these eukaryotic supergroups and kingdoms. Okay, so a new taxonomic group, the supergroup, has been created based on DNA analysis of organisms, and that's Archaeplastida, and that's the plants, red and green algae, Chromoviolata, the dinoflagellates, ciliates, diatoms, and you can read this. This will not be on your test, specifically all these names. It's just that we want to mention it to you. Excavata, the euglenoids, and the diplomonads, Rhizaria, radiolarians, okay, Amoebozoa, the amoebas and the slime-moles, and then Opisthoconta, animals, fungi, and the choanoflagellates. Okay, so eukarya and the eukaryotes. Okay, so again, the kingdom Protista, and we've already gone through these. Again, unicellular to few multicellular. We said that they photosynthesize, absorb, as well as ingest. Kingdom fungi, including your mushrooms. We said mostly multicellular. Your yeast and your ringworms. How do they get their food? They absorb their food. Kingdom plantae. We know that these are mostly multicellular, includes your mosses, your ferns, for example. And what do? We said that they can make their food. And then kingdom Animalia, multicellular, but we know that this includes the worms, fishes, insects, etc. And we know that they ingest their food. All right. So again, additional levels. So in other way, throwing in that super group as well. But we know again, and this is what you want to always remember, is that the domain is the most inclusive, and then the species is going to be the least inclusive. In the species, we know that this is where these organisms can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Even with the genus, it says you could have animals or organisms that are closely related, but they can interbreed, but they will not be able to produce fertile offspring. So the babies that they have would never be able to have a baby. Okay, categories of classifications continued. And I believe I'm supposed to stop. I'm out of time.